Hi everyone, my name is Natalie. Today I'm going to do another Curious Adventure video. So it's been a while since I made the last one, and to be honest it's just been the fact that kind of over the summer I think I've been reading a lot of fiction, so it hasn't really been a central part of my reading for a little bit after I think the BookTube Prize. Actually during September I only finished 4 books, and 3 of those were non-fiction books that fit into the Curious Adventure challenges. And so I thought that instead of just doing a wrap-up, I would just do a Curious Adventure check-in and talk about these 3 books and sort of wrap up the Curious Adventure challenges that I've done so far. If you don't know what Curious Adventure is, it is a non-fiction reading challenge, a year-long thing where you are encouraged to read nonfiction with specific challenges in mind to broaden your horizons, to have fun with it and all of that. I will link the announcement of the video if you're interested in more of the details, but obviously we're getting into the last few months of this year. And so I will just sort of go through the challenges that I have fulfilled. The first challenge being reading a book about a local celebrity or a local speciality. I read a book called Lyckliga Gatan. So this is a biography of Britt Lindeborg, who wrote the song Lyckliga Gatan, performed by Anna-Lena Löfgren. So it's basically like a songwriter's biography throughout the 20th century Sweden, and I really enjoyed the reading experience. I found that I got to learn a lot about local history that I don't necessarily know from school, and I didn't really have that much of an interest in history while I was still studying it, so it was a fun thing for me to explore my own country's history. And I think since joining BookTube I've sort of not been reading a lot of Swedish books, so that was really that was definitely one of my highlights of Curious Adventure so far. The next challenge is to read a nonfiction book that is with someone of a different experience to your own. So I left this very open, but I had initially thought of something like either disability or another race or ethnicity, and I decided to go with Notes on Blindness, which is basically like a journal of his of the 80s and 90s when he is losing his eyesight completely. A lot of this book is him talking about both his own personal experience of becoming blind and some of the things that he is missing out, like social interactions especially, and especially spontaneity in social interactions that I think is often overlooked from someone who doesn't have a problem with eyesight. But he also talks about some more general problems with a society that is built upon eyesight, and that as a standard, and how many unnecessary problems is caused for people with poor eyesight, and especially of course with blindness. So it was so illuminating for me. I thought it was smart and intelligent and so rewarding as a reading experience. Then we have the third challenge, which is celebrate something you love by reading more about it. So this is one of the books that I read in September, and that is The Last Stargazer by Emily Levesque. This is a book that I got as a NetGalley from the publisher, and it's basically a history of astronomy, the way that it's been done by humans, basically viewing the stars. And I thought, I have always loved looking up at the stars. I've always been drawn to space exploration and stargazing as things, and this year I've been really tapping into that. I've been reading several space-related books, and I think I will probably do a video talking about all of them together. Probably during Nonfiction November actually. But this is one of the ones that I've been reading, and I really enjoyed both sort of the combination of the author's personal experience as an astronomer, and she talks a lot about like the work in a more like day-to-day sort of situation, like what is the sort of challenges that comes up on a daily basis, what is the kind of problems with a telescope that can cause issues with the work that they do. For example, she talks about how telescopes are mostly exist in very distant sort of not isolated places, but like remote places, because of several things. One of them being that traffic and other various sound and light causes or sort of interrupts the telescope's ability to view stars. They have several issues that comes from the remoteness and sort of wild animals crawling into telescopes and sort of building nests there, or having beer visitors and that kind of thing. But also the actual building of the telescopes is not always appreciated by people living in the near vicinity of them. So there's several things to do with more on the sort of, I guess, technical side of stargazing in the current times and up to this point in history, but there's also some more general things to do with astronomy and beliefs and technology developing, but also a look ahead into the future and what we're probably going to be seeing with more robot telescopes and technology sort of taking over some of this work that is done by humans now, but have sort of slowly been replaced by computers. It's fascinating, and I think if you're interested in astronomy, I think this will have a lot of interesting information for you. And I think also Levesque has a really approachable style. The next challenge is read a collection of short writing that have been published elsewhere before. So what I was thinking was basically essay collections, because almost all essay collections that is published now have been, like, several of the essays have usually been published in magazines and things before they are collected into this book. And so the book that I read for this was Brown Album. It is a collection of essays with the lens of the Iranian American experience. So the author has sort of become like an ambassador for this experience, and she has written on several various topics related to that. So one of the things that she talks about is Nowruz, which is the Persian New Year celebrations, and how that looks in the US context. She talks about the very loaded and complicated relationship between Iran and the US, and how difficult it can be to build an identity with those two very clashing cultures, and especially the history that is between these two countries, and trying to figure out as an individual how you mesh those things together. She talks about culture things like pop culture, some of the value in seeing yourself in media and in mass media and representation in movies and in art and things like that. She talks about her own process into writing. So there's so many things going on in this book, but what I personally connected to so strongly was the identity, sort of creating your own identity as a young person in a Western country from an Iranian background. Obviously, she has been immigrated into the US, so she has some experiences that are completely different from my own, but I definitely recognized a lot of the conflicts of two cultures and trying to figure out where you stand in contrast to both of them, and the sort of navigating in between those and not being enough of either culture. And I think that is an experience that a lot of immigrant or second generation people could relate to. The sixth challenge is to browse a nonfiction shelf and pick up a book that sounds interesting to you in the moment, something that calls to you or that you haven't heard of. I decided to go with The Magical Language of Others by E.G. Coe, which I read in September. I had requested the library to buy a copy of this one, so I finally got it from my library and had it on a pile of books that I've been borrowing from the library. So it was a sort of a random choice of my library books. This is a Korean American writer's experience of, I think a lot of this is sort of reckoning with a family pain and family relationships, and some of the pain and trauma that is carried in these strong relationships. She and her family immigrated to the US when she was young, and her parents decide after a few years that they will go back to Korea because of her father's job situation, and he gets an offer that they can't refuse. So they decide to leave her with her older brother, so she is in her teens at that time, and so they decide to leave for the job for a few years during the time that the contract is, and they end up extending that period over and over again so that they actually separate for almost 10 years. And so this book is her both sort of in conversation with her mother, because her mother has sent her several letters during this time that they've been separated, and Ichiko translates these letters as well as talks in general about her relationship with her mother, the feelings of being abandoned in the US, and also the complications, because it's clear to me anyway that she loves her mother and her family, but it's a very complicated and weighted relationship that isn't, there's a lot of things that isn't sort of so straightforward in their relationship. And so this book is her confronting a lot of the emotional burdens in the relationship of the family, of the feelings of resentment, even of being abandoned, with her brother, who she seems to have a complicated relationship to as well. But a lot of it is also about her writing process and finding her identity as an individual and as a writer, and coming into poetry from the urgent need to sort of express herself and put some of the emotional like chaos inside of her out. A lot of exploration of violence as well, both in terms of her grandmother's experiences during the wars and World War II. Some of it is more on the psychological side of things, and also self-destructive behavior, and but the way she approaches things is just a really interesting contrast. The way she writes about these things and the way you experience them as a reader. I thought it was beautiful, and I was really impressed by her as a writer. The 10th challenge is to read a graphic nonfiction. So I decided to go with this one that isn't actually a graphic memoir or graphic nonfiction, but is illustrated in a way. And so that is Wayward Life, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Riotous Black Girls, Troublesome Women, and Queer Radicals by Saidiya Hartman. This is the third book I read in September. It has so many photographs. So just to give you some examples, it has tons and tons of photographs, as well as like statistics and things, but it's mainly the photographs that is such an important, integral part of this book, that makes, I feel like in a way it almost feels like this author used the photographs as her starting point to write the book, and a lot of the ways that she tries to visualize these stories that you can see in the photographs. So what is this book about? This is a history of Black women and men in the at the turn of the century in the US. So the late 19th century, early 20th century, up to the 20s, maybe even 30s. And it's talking about women and men, especially women, who go against the grain, who rebel against social constrictions, social restraints, social norms. It's about them trying to live free lives, and sometimes it is free in the sense of sexuality, sometimes it's in the sense of queerness and homosexuality, sometimes it's just sort of related to work and what kind of work you do. A lot of this book is sort of giving voice to people who have been silenced or forgotten or overlooked for a long period of time of history. And so it's sort of, in a way, it's also graphic or illustrated in the sense that it is creating these stories visually and narratively. She is trying to imagine these men and women and how they lived, and filling in the gaps in what they were thinking and how they were feeling based on the information that you can find, because a lot of the problem with this history not being told before is because there's no resources, there's no documentation that has been kept, because these lives and these stories have not mattered to the people who do the collecting of documentation and making sure that these things, these information bits don't get lost in history. So it's a really epic idea of history telling that Hardman both is willing to provide history with a strong sense of uncertainty, but also it feels like the whole point of the book is to illustrate these lives and the kind of struggles that they had, the kind of challenges and the unfairness of their lives, but also the beautiful thing in their rebellion and in their resilience as well. The next challenge is another one of those that I've already done videos for, that is read a book that is published by a new to you publisher or press, and I decided to go with Once Upon a Time I Lived on Mars. This was published by St. Martin's Press. This is another essay collection. It's talking about Mars exploration and talking about living in isolation, which seemed very apt to the time that I read it in earlier this year. It talks about some of the challenges in living in isolation in terms of boredom and keeping track of time and everything sort of meshing together, the monotony of the everyday. And I thought there was a lot of interesting discussion going on around Mars exploration in terms of who is involved in these projects, who is financially behind these kind of projects, and what is the results of those people having the money to get the power to how these projects go about. It had a lot of things like food for thought for me, and even things like the selection process of who becomes an astronaut is so based on very specific criteria that isn't necessarily neutral. Again, it's loaded with exclusion criteria, so that was also really interesting to me. So that is my progress with Curious Adventures so far, and hopefully I will be able to catch up with the rest of the challenges and do two more check-ins before the end of the year. If you've read any of these books, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you're doing Curious Adventure, I would love to hear your progress. Or if you in general are interested in any of the books that I've talked about, I would love to hear about that as well. Hope you're doing well and you're taking care of yourselves. I will talk to you soon. Bye.